Kira was a young woman, just 24 years old, and had always tried to keep her head down, not wanting to attract attention. She had grown up in the city and knew how important it was to stay unnoticed. Her father, Officer Darren Hayes, had always told her to walk with confidence and never let anyone push her around. But today was different. It was a warm Thursday afternoon, and Kira had just finished a few errands in the city. She'd picked up some groceries from the store, and now she was heading to the bus stop to catch a ride home. She had a lot on her mind. The day had been busy, and she was ready to relax and unwind in her small apartment. As she walked along the sidewalk, her sneakers making soft thuds on the pavement, she thought about the dinner she would cook later. Maybe pasta, she mused. It had been a long day, but nothing out of the ordinary. But things were about to take a turn. As she walked down the street, she noticed two police officers standing near their squad car. They were just chatting, but Kira couldn't help but feel a bit uneasy. She had always been aware of how others looked at her, especially when she was out in the city. As a young black woman, she often felt the eyes of others on her, either judging her or questioning her place in the world. She had learned to ignore it, to keep her head straight and her shoulders back. But today, something was different. The officers turned their heads as Kira passed, and one of them called out to her. Kira felt her chest tighten as the officer handed her ID back, but there was no sense of relief. The tension still hung thick in the air. The officer didn't back off or offer any apologies. In fact, he seemed to be growing more impatient. Kira noticed the second officer, who had been standing silently in the background, start to move closer, his eyes narrowing slightly as though he was trying to assess her in a new light. She didn't like the way he was looking at her, as though she were an object to be analyzed. "Why are you giving us such a hard time?" the first officer asked, his voice no longer just cold but tinged with irritation. He crossed his arms over his chest, blocking her path as if she would try to run away. Kira had no intention of running. She wasn't going to back down from this, not without Nakara's heart. Kira walked away from the scene, her heart still pounding but now with a different energy. It wasn't the kind of pounding you feel when you're scared or anxious. No, this was the kind of pounding that came from standing your ground, from having your voice heard, even if it was just in a moment like this. It was the kind of feeling that made her realize something deep within herself: she had power. And it was the kind of power she had never thought she could tap into before. As she walked down the street, the weight of everything that had happened began to settle in. The officers, once so confident in their authority, had stepped back. They had apologized, something she hadn't expected. Kira wasn't sure what had made them change their approach, whether it was her father's name or simply the fact that she hadn't backed down. But whatever it was, it had worked. But as Kira moved through the city, her thoughts started to spiral. The relief she felt started to fade, replaced by a deep, gnawing discomfort. What had just happened to her? Why did she have to be the one to stand up to them? Why did it take her father's name for those officers to show her the respect she deserved from the start? The questions lingered in her mind like a shadow, making her feel unsettled. She glanced around at the people walking past her, some of them oblivious to what had just taken place. She could see the indifference in their faces, people just going about their day, not knowing or caring about the injustice that could have happened if she hadn't spoken up. Kira knew it wasn't just about her. She wasn't the only one who had been treated this way. She wasn't the only one who had been stopped, questioned, and judged without cause. How many others had been in situations like hers? How many had felt the same fear, the same helplessness, but didn't have the connections or the courage to stand up for themselves? It bothered her, this thought. She couldn't ignore the realization that she was lucky that she had a father in law enforcement, lucky that her father's reputation had given her a way to turn the tide. But what about the others? What about the people who didn't have that same privilege? How many others had been treated the same way, With no one to step in, no one to make the officers think twice. Her mind raced back to the moment when she had said her father's name. She hadn't intended to use it as leverage. She had never wanted to use his name to get out of trouble. But in that moment, it felt like the only option. Her father had always taught her to respect the law, to believe in fairness, but he had also told her to be aware of the way the world saw her. He had always told her that life wasn't always fair, especially for people like her, and that sometimes you had to use what you had to get by. In that moment, she had used it and it had worked. But the truth was, that wasn't fair. She stopped walking and stood at a corner, looking up at the buildings around her. The city was full of life, but in that moment, it felt distant and cold. The same city where she had grown up, where she had learned to navigate life, had just shown her a side she hadn't realized existed. It wasn't a side she had been blind to, but it was one she hadn't fully understood until now. Kira closed her eyes for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts. She could still feel the weight of the officers' eyes on her, the way they had sized her up like she was a suspect. They hadn't seen her as a person first, they had seen her as someone to be controlled. And it wasn't just the officers, it was the whole system. It was the way people like her were often treated, dismissed, ignored, or stereotyped based on their appearance. Her heart ached as she thought of the countless others who hadn't been able to speak up, who hadn't had the opportunity to challenge the system, even when it was wrong. But Kira wasn't going to let that be her story. She wasn't going to let this one moment define who she was or how she saw the world. This was just the beginning. She realized that she had a choice. She could let this experience consume her, let it turn her bitter and resentful, or she could use it as fuel to change the way she saw the world and the way the world saw her. She knew which path she wanted to take. As she stood there on the corner, watching the people pass by, Kira made a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't let the world silence her. She wouldn't let fear dictate her actions. She would use her voice, her strength, and whatever power she had to make sure she was never treated like that again. And she wouldn't stop there. She would speak up for others, too. She would be the person who stood for justice, even when it felt uncomfortable. Even when the odds were against her. Her thoughts turned back to her father. Officer Darren Hayes. She thought about how proud he had always been of her, about the way he had taught her to stand up for what was right, even when it was hard. She had always looked up to him, but now, in this moment, she saw him in a new light. He hadn't just been an officer to her. He had been an example of integrity and strength, someone who had fought for justice in his own way. And maybe it was time for her to start following that example, to use her own voice to fight for change, to speak up when things weren't right. Kira knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles to fight, more obstacles to overcome. But she also knew that she wasn't alone in this. She had her father's strength, but more importantly, she had her own. She was no longer just a girl walking down the street, trying to get home. She was a woman who had found her voice, and she was ready to use it. She took a deep breath and started walking again, this time with a newfound sense of purpose. The city no longer felt cold and distant, it felt alive, full of potential. Kira had a long way to go, but this moment had changed something in her. It had opened her eyes to the power of standing up for herself, of using her voice, and of refusing to be silenced. As Kira walked, she knew that this was just the beginning. There was so much more to do, so many more people to fight for, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had taken her first step, and she would continue to walk toward the future with confidence, knowing that no matter what came next, she was ready to face it. She was ready to fight for a world where justice wasn't just something you had to fight for, but something everyone could have. The sun was setting as she walked toward her bus stop, and the sky above her turned a beautiful shade of orange. She felt the warmth of the moment in her chest, a reminder that change was possible. And as the bus pulled up, Kira stepped onto it, knowing that this was just the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter where her voice would be heard. Still pounding in her chest as she stood there, watching the officers walk back to their squad car. She felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced with something deeper, something that still didn't. Kira stood there, facing the officers, her heart pounding in her chest. The air around her seemed to shift in an instant. What had started as a tense, uncomfortable encounter was now turning into something different, something that she hadn't anticipated. The mention of her father's name, Officer Darren Hayes, had made an immediate impact. She could see it in the officers' eyes, the sudden hesitation, the way they shifted on their feet, unsure of how to proceed. The officer who had been the most aggressive took a step back, his expression softening ever so slightly. His earlier bravado had disappeared, replaced with something like uncertainty. The officer beside him, who had remained silent most of the time, now seemed to shift his weight uneasily, looking at Kira and then at his partner, as though waiting for direction. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Kira felt a sense of power that she had never experienced before. It was strange, the way her father's name seemed to change everything. She wasn't just some random woman being questioned, she was the daughter of a man who had earned respect, who had worked hard to build his reputation. And now, that reputation was affecting the way the officers treated her. She had always been proud of her father, but now, in this moment, she was seeing the weight of his influence in a way she had never imagined. The silence stretched for a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The first officer, the one who had grabbed her wrist earlier, cleared his throat and finally spoke, but his tone was noticeably different. It was no longer harsh or condescending, instead, it was laced with a quiet nervousness. "Officer Hayes," he said, almost as if saying the name itself held power. "I didn't realize." Kira didn't know how to respond at first. She had never wanted to use her father's name to get out of trouble, but now, as the situation played out before her, it felt like the only way to make them stop treating her like an outsider. She wasn't going to let them walk away from this without realizing that what they had done to her was wrong. "That's right," Kira said firmly, her voice strong despite the nervousness that was still bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm his daughter. And I'm not going to stand here while you try to intimidate me for no reason." The second officer, the quieter one, shifted his feet uncomfortably. His face reddened slightly as though he was trying to avoid eye contact. The first officer, who had been leading the interaction, now stood with his arms crossed, no longer quite as confident as he had been moments before. He looked down at Kira's ID, which he had handed back to her earlier, almost as though trying to find something to say to justify the situation. But there was nothing. Kira could see the wheels turning in his mind. He was trying to figure out if there was any way he could salvage his pride. But Kira wasn't interested in saving anyone's pride. She wasn't going to let them walk away from this without acknowledging what had happened. "You don't get to treat people like this," Kira continued, her voice unwavering. "You don't get to stop someone without cause and then bully them for no reason at all. I'm not afraid of you." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Kira could almost feel the officers shrinking under her gaze. It was strange. She wasn't yelling, she wasn't being confrontational in the way they expected. She was simply telling them the truth. And it made all the difference. The first officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner before taking a deep breath. "You're right," he said, his voice softer now. "This wasn't handled the right way. We apologize." Kira blinked, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected an apology, not in a million years. She had thought they would just try to get out of the situation as quickly as possible, maybe even brush it off. But this was different. The officer's tone was sincere, almost sheepish. "We should have treated you with more respect," he continued, rubbing the back of his neck. We were just doing our job, but we see now that we went about it all wrong." Sorry. The apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't going to erase the way they had made her feel, the way they had tried to intimidate her for no reason, but it was a start. Kira watched them, unsure of how to react. She didn't know what she had expected, but it certainly wasn't this. Still, a small part of her felt like she had won. She had stood up for herself, and now the officers were backing off. "Thank you," Kira said, her voice still calm but with a hint of firmness. "I appreciate the apology. But this needs to be a reminder that people can't just be treated like that. Not because of who they are, or what they look like. Not because they don't have the right connections." The second officer nodded in agreement, his face still slightly flushed but softer now. "Yeah," he muttered, glancing at his partner. We'll be more careful in the future." Kira took a deep breath and nodded, still not fully sure how to process everything. Her emotions were all over the place: relief, frustration, disbelief, even a little pride. But as she stood there, watching the two officers walk back to their squad car, she knew one thing for sure: this wasn't over. The incident had left a mark on her, one that would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just about this single moment. It was about what it represented: the way she had been treated for no reason, the way society too often overlooked or mistreated people based on their appearance. And it was about the power of standing up for herself. She watched as the officers got into their car and drove off, their lights flashing briefly before they turned the corner. The street was quieter now, the tension dissipating as the sound of the car faded into the distance. Kira stood there for a moment, her heart still racing, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She knew that not everyone would have the same experience. Not everyone would have the same chance to turn the tables the way she had. But she also knew that she had done something important today. And for the first time, she felt like she wasn't just another person walking through the city. She wasn't just another black woman trying to make her way through life unnoticed. Today, she had made herself visible. Today, she had made sure the world knew who she was, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Kira took a deep breath and started walking again, this time with her head held a little higher. The street seemed quieter, more peaceful now, as if the world had paused just long enough to listen to her. And for a moment, Kira felt like she was finally in control of her own story. Feel quite right. She wasn't sure what it was. She hadn't been arrested, and the officers had finally let her go, but there was this gnawing feeling in her stomach that wouldn't go away. It wasn't about the incident itself, it was about the realization that this could have gone so much worse. What if the man hadn't stepped in? What if she had been alone? She glanced around the street, feeling the eyes of onlookers on her, some offering looks of concern, while others just walked on by, as if nothing had happened. She could feel the weight of their stares, but this time, it didn't matter. It didn't matter because she had stood her ground. But it also didn't feel like enough. It didn't feel like the victory she had hoped for. Just as she was about to walk away, feeling a mix of both relief and frustration, the older man who had intervened earlier approached her. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Kira was a little startled. She hadn't expected him to approach, but there was something about the way he spoke that made her feel like she wasn't just another passerby to him. I'm fine, I guess," Kira said, still catching her breath. "I don't know what just happened. I've never been treated like that before." The man nodded sympathetically. "I could see that. You did good. It's not easy to stay calm when you're being treated unfairly." Kira didn't know what to say. She didn't know him, and yet, there was a sense of trust in his presence. His calm demeanor, the way he spoke to her without judgment, it felt like a strange kind of comfort in a world that often made her feel out of place. "Thank you," Kira said, her voice softening. "I didn't know what to do, but I couldn't just let them walk all over me." The man looked at her for a moment, his eyes searching her face as if he was weighing something in his mind. After a few seconds, he spoke again. "You know," he said, "this might sound strange, but I think I know your father." Kira blinked, surprised. Her father was a police officer, well respected in the department. But she didn't think anyone outside of his colleagues would know him. "Really?" she asked, still trying to process what he meant. "You know my dad?" The man nodded. "Yeah. I've heard of him. Officer Darren Hayes, right?" At the mention of her father's name, Kira felt a sudden shift in the air. It was like a switch had been flipped. She had always known her father to be someone with authority, someone who commanded respect in his profession, but she had never thought about how his name could affect situations like this. She had never imagined it would come up in a moment like this, with her being treated unfairly by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Kira didn't know whether to feel comforted or unsettled by his words. Her father's name had power, she knew that. He was an officer, and people knew who he was. He had always been there for her, and she had always looked up to him. But hearing his name now, in this context, felt different. It felt like the kind of leverage she had never thought about using before. "I didn't know you knew him," Kira said, her voice steady but her mind racing. "But, yes, that's my father." The man seemed to sense her confusion and gave her a reassuring smile. "I used to work with him. Not directly, but we crossed paths a few times. He's a good guy. A respected officer." Kira nodded, still processing everything. The officer who had been questioning her wasn't just dealing with a random person on the street. He was dealing with someone whose father was a respected figure in the police force. Suddenly, the whole situation felt different to her, as if the rules of the game had changed. She stood there for a moment, looking at the man who had stepped in to help her. She wasn't sure why he was telling her this, but something in his tone made her feel like he wasn't just some stranger trying to make small talk. It was as if he knew something more, something that was about to become important. "I think," the man said slowly, "you should remind those officers of who your father is." Kira's eyes widened at the suggestion. Her heart began to race again, but this time, the adrenaline was different. It wasn't fear anymore, it was something else. It was the realization that maybe she had more power in this situation than she thought. She wasn't just a random woman on the street. She was Officer Darren Hayes' daughter. And for the first time, she considered using that fact to her advantage. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man gave her a knowing look. "I'm sure of it. The moment you mention your father's name, those officers will remember who they're dealing with. They'll back off. They'll think twice before treating you like that again." Kira's thoughts were spinning. She wasn't sure if she was ready to play this card, but something about the man's words resonated with her. He was right. Her father's name carried weight. And while it wasn't fair that she had to rely on it, the reality was that it might be the only thing that could make the officers take a step back. "Thank you," Kira said, looking at him with a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. "I didn't know what to do before, but now I feel like I have a choice." The man smiled again, this time a little more gently. "You do have a choice. You always did." He turned to walk away, and Kira watched him for a moment before looking back at the squad car, still parked a few feet away. The officers were still inside, likely talking about what had just happened. She wasn't sure if they knew about her father or if they cared, but one thing was for sure: she had just learned that she had the power to change the outcome of this situation. She didn't have to stay silent anymore. Kira took a deep breath and turned back toward the officers. Her heart was still racing, but now it wasn't out of fear. It was out of determination. She wasn't going to let them get away with this. She wasn't going to let them push her around just because she was alone. She stepped forward and, with a steady voice, called out to the officers. "You don't know who my father is, do you?" The officers, who had been speaking quietly to each other in the car, froze. They looked at each other, clearly unsure of how to react to her words. Kira took another step closer and repeated herself, this time louder. "My father is Officer Darren Hayes." The effect was immediate. The two officers looked at each other, their expressions changing in an instant. The tension in the air seemed to disappear, replaced by an awkward silence. The officer who had been the most aggressive earlier seemed to shrink a little under her gaze. For the first time, Kira felt like she had control of the situation. Her father's name carried more than just the weight of a badge, it carried the weight of respect. And in that moment, Kira understood what it meant to stand up for herself, not just for who she was, but for the legacy her father had built. Why she was being treated this way. "I've told you already," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just heading home." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unsatisfied with her explanation. "Home, huh?" He smirked, as if that wasn't good enough for him. "Just a regular girl with groceries, right?" "Yes," Kira said, her hands shaking slightly as she held onto her shopping bag. "That's exactly what I am. A regular girl going home." The officer's gaze dropped to her hands, and Kira could feel his eyes scanning her from head to toe, as though he were looking for any reason to escalate the situation further. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, and Kira instinctively took a small step back, trying to maintain some distance between them. "You know, it's funny," the officer said, his voice lowering, almost as if speaking to himself. "You don't look like you belong here." Kira felt the sting of his words hit her. She didn't understand what he meant by that, but the implication was clear. The way he spoke, as though she were an outsider in her own neighborhood, made her feel small and insignificant. It reminded her of the times she had walked down the street and felt eyes watching her, judging her for just existing. "I belong wherever I choose to be," Kira responded, her voice stronger now. She wasn't going to let him push her around. She knew she had to stay calm and composed, but it was hard when she felt so threatened. The officer's words were cutting deep, and she could sense that this was turning into something far more uncomfortable than a simple stop. He tilted his head slightly, as though considering her response. But before he could say anything else, the second officer spoke, his tone more clipped than before. "Maybe we should check your bag. You might be hiding something." Kira's heart skipped a beat. Check her bag? For what? She hadn't done anything wrong, yet they were treating her like a criminal. Her mind raced with questions, but her instincts told her to stay calm and not react too aggressively. She could feel the knot in her stomach tightening. "Is this really necessary?" Kira asked, trying to stay composed. She wasn't going to let them just search her without a reason. Her father had always told her that she had rights, and if she was being detained, she had the right to know why. The first officer shot her a look, his eyes narrowing. "We're just making sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." Kira took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't right. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She wasn't some criminal to be interrogated and searched for no reason. She was just a young woman trying to get home, but in their eyes, she was nothing more than a target. The second officer stepped forward, clearly ready to take the next step. But just as he moved closer, Kira felt a sudden burst of courage. This wasn't how things were going to go down. She couldn't just stand there and let them control the situation without question. "I'm not giving you permission to search my bag," she said firmly. The words came out more forcefully than she intended, but they felt right. She wasn't just going to let them make assumptions about her. The officers exchanged a look, and Kira saw something flicker in their eyes. Was it frustration? Annoyance? Or maybe just the realization that she wasn't backing down? Whatever it was, it made the air between them crackle with tension. "Do you know how easy it would be for us to arrest you right now?" the first officer said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Kira swallowed hard but kept her ground. "Arrest me for what?" she asked, her voice not wavering. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just walking down the street. You have no reason to arrest me." The officer's face reddened with anger, and Kira could see the shift in his posture. He was no longer playing the role of the calm, professional officer. He was letting his emotions take over, and Kira could see it. She knew she had to stay calm. The more she stood her ground, the more the officer seemed to lose control. It was a subtle shift, but Kira could feel it. She glanced around, noticing that people were starting to slow down as they walked past. Some people gave her curious looks, while others quickened their pace, avoiding the scene. Kira's stomach churned with discomfort. She didn't want to be the center of attention, but she was. She was the one being stopped, the one being questioned for no reason. "What's going on here?" a voice suddenly called out from behind her. Kira's eyes widened slightly as she turned to see an older man walking toward her. He was dressed in a business suit, and his face seemed familiar. She couldn't place him at first, but there was something about the way he walked with confidence, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. The officer seemed momentarily distracted by the man's approach, and Kira seized the opportunity to step back just a little. She couldn't explain why, but something about the man's presence made her feel safer. "Do you need something, sir?" the first officer asked, his voice still laced with irritation. The older man didn't seem intimidated by the officer at all. "I'm asking you what's going on. You're stopping this young woman for no reason. I've been watching this whole thing." The second officer looked uncomfortable now, but the first officer wasn't backing down. "We're just questioning her, sir. It's routine." "Routine," the older man replied, his tone cold. "I don't think so. You don't just stop someone without cause. And you certainly don't threaten them in the process." Kira felt a small sense of relief wash over her. This man, whoever he was stepping in when it felt like no one else would. It was like a small light in a dark room. The officers exchanged another glance, clearly unsure of what to do next. Kira's pulse was still racing, but now she had someone on her side, someone who saw what was happening and wasn't afraid to call it out. "Are you going to let her go now?" the man asked, his eyes never leaving the officers. The first officer seemed to hesitate, his bravado fading slightly. "We'll see," he muttered, clearly not pleased with the intervention. As the officers began to step back, Kira felt a small victory rise within her. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She wasn't alone. The world wasn't as dark and cold as it had felt just moments ago. The officers turned away, their expressions still frustrated, but they didn't say anything more. Kira watched as they walked back to their squad car, her heart still pounding in her chest. But she wasn't defeated. Not this time. She had stood her ground, and for the first time in a long while, Kira felt a sense of empowerment, no matter how small it was. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" Kira froze, her heart beginning to race. She wasn't sure what was happening. She didn't know why they were speaking to her. She hadn't done anything wrong. "Can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. The officer's tone was harsh as he approached. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Kira's eyes flicked to the other officer, who was standing back, arms crossed. He was watching her, his eyes narrowing slightly. She felt a sense of unease grow in her stomach. Why was this happening? She had done nothing wrong. "Questions about what?" Kira asked, her voice more firm now, though she couldn't stop the nervousness from creeping in. She had learned from her father that it was important to stay calm and ask for clarity, but the suddenness of the interaction had caught her off guard. The first officer stepped closer to her, his gaze scanning her up and down. "You just seem out of place," he said. "What are you doing here?" Kira was taken aback. She wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just walking down the street, heading home. She glanced around at the busy sidewalk, filled with people going about their business. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing out of the ordinary. Why was she being stopped? "I'm just heading home," she said, trying to remain as calm as possible. "I've got groceries, and I'm waiting for the bus." The officer didn't seem convinced. He took a step closer, his face hardening as he looked down at her. "We're just making sure. You fit the description of someone we've been looking for." Kira's heart sank. The description? She didn't understand. What description? "I'm just a regular person trying to get home. I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer was unmoved. "You can either cooperate, or we'll have to do this the hard way." Kira's mind was racing. What was going on? Why was she being treated like this? She had heard stories, read about incidents where people had been stopped by the police without cause, but she never imagined it would happen to her. She never thought she would be in this position. "Is there a reason you're stopping me?" Kira asked again, her voice more firm now, though her hands were shaking slightly. The officer didn't answer immediately. He just stared at her, sizing her up, as though trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. After a few long seconds, he spoke again, his voice cold. "ID now." Kira felt a wave of frustration sweep over her. She hadn't done anything wrong. She wasn't breaking any laws, yet here she was, being questioned by two officers for no reason at all. Her mind flashed to her father, Officer Darren Hayes. He had always told her that if she was ever in a situation like this, she should remain calm, stay respectful, and always know her rights. But right now, it was hard to stay calm. She wanted to shout, to demand an explanation, but she knew that wouldn't help. Slowly, she pulled out her wallet and handed over her ID. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, studying her every move. She felt exposed, vulnerable. The officer took the ID and glanced at it, then back at her. "Kira Hayes," he muttered under his breath. He didn't seem impressed. "That name doesn't mean anything to me. Where are you really headed?" Kira's heart skipped a beat. The officer didn't know her, and she didn't expect him to. But in that moment, she was reminded of how quickly things could spiral out of control. She was just a young woman walking home, but the way she was being treated made her feel small and insignificant. She could hear the second officer still watching from behind, his expression unreadable. She wished she could walk away, but she knew that wasn't an option. Not now. Not with the way the first officer was looking at her. "I told you," she said, trying to keep her composure. "I'm just heading home. I've done nothing wrong." The first officer scoffed, clearly uninterested in her explanation. "We'll see about that." He continued to hold her ID, studying it closely, as if waiting for something to jump out at him. Kira's pulse was racing. She had never felt so trapped, so powerless. She had always known there was a certain tension when it came to interactions with the police, especially for people like her. But to experience it firsthand standing on the sidewalk, her groceries in hand, trying to explain herself was something she had never imagined. What was the reason for all of this? Why was she being treated like this? The questions spun in her mind, but no answers came. She had no idea where this was going, but she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to let herself be intimidated. Not now. Not ever. As the officer continued to hold her ID, Kira's thoughts began to race. She couldn't help but feel a deep sense of injustice creeping in. She wasn't just another person to be dismissed or interrogated. She was Kira Hayes. She wasn't going to let them get away with this. But as the officer finally handed her ID back to her, Kira felt something change in the air. It was subtle, but it was there. She hadn't said anything yet, but something had shifted in her. She was about to take a stand whether the officers knew it or not. They would soon learn who she was.